Executive Arab found his African maid sleeping in the bathroom and fell madly in love. He was a man of power, wealth, and absolute control, an untouchable executive who ruled his world with an iron fist. She was nothing more than a maid, invisible in his lavish mansion, working tirelessly before the sun even rose. They lived under the same roof, but existed in different worlds. Until one night, when he found her asleep on the bathroom floor, exhausted, broken, and completely unaware that this single moment would change both of their lives forever. How does love survive when the world refuses to accept it? What happens when an untouchable man falls for the woman society tells him he can't have? Stay until the end for an unforgettable and heartbreaking twist. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next powerful story. The silence of the night wrapped around the towering Al-Fayez mansion, a modern palace standing in the heart of New York City. Every inch of the estate screamed power, wealth, and an untouchable status. Yet inside its walls, one life was pushed beyond exhaustion, unnoticed by the man who owned it all. Khaled Al-Fayez, the ruthless and calculated Arab executive, was the master of his universe. Nothing in his life was left to chance. Every deal, every decision, every detail was meticulously controlled. To him, emotions were a weakness, and attachments were distractions. Tonight, however, something felt different. Sleep eluded him despite the heavy workload that had consumed his entire day. He loosened the collar of his silk shirt and stepped out of his bedroom, his expensive leather shoes making soft echoes against the marble floor. He rarely wandered through his mansion at this hour, but something in the stillness called him forward. As he passed the staff quarters, a strange noise caught his attention, a faint, rhythmic breathing. He frowned. The house staff had strict schedules. No one should be awake at this hour. Following the sound, he reached the employee restroom, a place he had never stepped foot in before. The door was slightly ajar. Without thinking, he pushed it open, and there she was. Curled up in the corner, using a pile of cleaning rags as a pillow, lay Aisha Diallo, his housemaid. Her uniform was slightly wrinkled, her arms wrapped around herself for warmth, her face soft with exhaustion. Khaled's breath caught in his throat. What was she doing here? Why wasn't she in her room? His gaze dropped to her worn-out shoes, the frayed edges of her sleeves. A strange feeling stirred in his chest, something unfamiliar, something unsettling. He crouched down, eyes locked onto her face. His usual cold, calculating mind struggled to rationalize what he was seeing. He had never paid much attention to her before. She was just another employee, another shadow in his world. But now, seeing her like this, small, vulnerable, completely drained, something shifted inside him. He reached out, hesitated, then gently touched her shoulder. "Aisha," he said, his voice quieter than usual. She jolted awake, eyes wide with panic. Her breathing hitched as she realized who was in front of her. "Sir, I'm sorry," she stammered, scrambling to sit up properly. "I didn't mean to." Khaled held up a hand, silencing her. "Why are you sleeping here?" She hesitated. How could she explain that she woke up at 3 a.m. every morning to make sure the mansion was spotless before he even opened his eyes? That she barely had time to breathe, let alone rest? That some nights, exhaustion hit her so hard, she couldn't even make it back to her room? I was just resting for a moment," she whispered, eyes downcast. Khaled studied her face. He could see the dark circles beneath her eyes, the fatigue carved into her features. He should have felt indifferent. He should have walked away. Instead, He said something completely out of character. "Come with me." Aisha's eyes snapped up to his. "What?" His voice was firm, commanding. "Now." Her heart pounded as she followed him out of the restroom, unsure of what awaited her. Little did she know. This night would change both of their lives forever. Aisha followed Khaled down the dimly lit hallway, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. The cold marble beneath her feet only heightened her discomfort. This was wrong. She wasn't supposed to be walking beside him like this. She cast a cautious glance at the man in front of her. Khaled Al-Fayez. The untouchable, the unreachable. He was a man of wealth and control, a man who barely noticed the existence of those who served him. And yet here she was, being led by him, away from the restroom where she had collapsed in exhaustion. Where was he taking her? Her thoughts raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. Had she broken a rule she didn't even know existed? Was she about to be fired for something as simple as resting for a few minutes? Khaled stopped in front of a door she recognized instantly, his office. She hesitated at the threshold, but he gestured for her to step inside. "Sit," he ordered, his voice controlled but unreadable. Aisha obeyed, lowering herself onto the sleek leather chair across from his massive mahogany desk. The room was as intimidating as the man himself. Everything in it screamed power. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the glowing New York skyline, while shelves lined with books and expensive artifacts reflected his high status. Khaled settled into his chair, fingers interlocked as he studied her. The silence stretched between them, suffocating, thick with unspoken thoughts. Finally, he broke it. "What time do you start working every day?" Aisha's hands tightened into her lap. She swallowed hard. 3 in the morning, sir." His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes flickered. "And what time do you finish?" She hesitated. "It depends. Usually around 10 at night." For the first time in her life, she saw Khaled Al-Fayez frown. "You're working 19 hours a day?" His voice was low, but there was a sharp edge to it, something she couldn't quite place. She looked away. "It's just how things are, sir." His gaze darkened. "Who assigned you that schedule?" She hesitated again. The truth was, no one had forced her, but she knew the expectations of working for a man like Khaled. The mansion had to be perfect before he even woke up. His world had to function flawlessly, and if that meant sacrificing sleep, so be it. Khaled leaned forward, his elbows resting on his desk. His next words surprised her. "You won't work those hours anymore." Aisha's head snapped up. "What?" "You'll start at 6. You'll finish at 6. 12 hours, no more." Her stomach tightened. "But that's not how it works, sir. There's too much to do." "I don't care," he cut her off. "I won't have my employees collapsing in bathrooms." Aisha's breath caught. Was this really happening? Was Khaled Al-Fayez, this cold, ruthless man, showing concern for her? She searched his face for a trace of mockery, but there was none. Only a quiet, unwavering authority. I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't need to say anything." He stood, signaling that the conversation was over. "Go get some proper rest." She rose hesitantly, but before she could turn to leave, he spoke again. "Aisha." She looked back, startled to hear her name roll off his tongue so effortlessly. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a split second she saw something in them she never expected. Something dangerous. Something that sent a shiver down her spine. From now on, I'll be paying more attention to you." Aisha lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep despite the rare opportunity Khalid had given her. His words echoed in her mind. "From now on, I'll be paying more attention to you." What did that even mean? No one ever caught his attention unless they were essential to his business. He was a man of cold efficiency, barely acknowledging the existence of those beneath him. Yet, for some reason, he had noticed her, a simple maid working in the shadows of his empire. Morning arrived, and she forced herself out of bed, still haunted by the events of the previous night. She expected things to return to normal, for Khaled to go back to his world of boardrooms and business deals, forgetting whatever concern had momentarily possessed him. But when she stepped into the kitchen to begin her shift, the entire household was buzzing. "Have you heard?" one of the other maids whispered. "Mr. Al-Fayez changed Aisha's schedule." Another gasped. "Why? He's never cared about things like that before." Aisha lowered her gaze, hurrying past them. She didn't want to be the center of gossip, but deep down, she couldn't deny the uneasy feeling creeping over her. Later that morning, as she was wiping down the grand staircase, she heard his voice. "Aisha!" She turned sharply, gripping the railing for support. Khalid stood at the bottom of the staircase, watching her. He was dressed in a charcoal grey suit, the kind that made him look even more untouchable, yet his gaze wasn't distant today. It was focused on her. She swallowed. "Yes, sir?" "Come to my office after you're done here." A lump formed in her throat. He didn't wait for a response. He never did. He simply turned and walked away, leaving her with a flurry of unanswered questions. She finished her task as quickly as she could and made her way to his office, her heart pounding in anticipation. The door was open when she arrived, and she hesitated for only a second before stepping inside. Khalid sat behind his massive desk, his fingers tapping lightly against the polished wood. He gestured for her to sit. She obeyed, her back straight, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I have a question," he said, studying her carefully. "Why haven't you ever complained about your workload?" She blinked. Of all the things he could have asked, she hadn't expected that. "It's not my place to complain, sir." His jaw tightened slightly. "So you would rather suffer in silence?" She hesitated. "It's not suffering if it's just the way things are." Khalid exhaled through his nose, as if frustrated by her answer. He leaned forward. "And how exactly do you see yourself?" She frowned, unsure of what he meant. "I'm your employee, sir." His gaze darkened. "No, you're much more than that." Her breath hitched. A warning flashed in her mind, but it was already too late. Something had shifted between them. She shook her head. "Sir, You wake up at 3 in the morning just to make sure everything is perfect before I even open my eyes." His voice was lower now, almost dangerous. "You sacrifice your own health to keep this house running, and yet I never once noticed. That was my mistake." Aisha's stomach twisted. She had spent years making herself invisible, ensuring she was just another moving part in the grand machine of Khalid's world. And now, suddenly, he was seeing her. She forced herself to breathe. "It wasn't a mistake, sir. You're a busy man. I'm just doing my job." Khalid studied her for a long moment, then stood. He walked around the desk, stopping directly in front of her. "You think so little of yourself," he murmured. "But I don't." Her pulse pounded in her ears. This was wrong. He was her boss. This was the same man who barely acknowledged her existence just days ago. And yet, now he was looking at her as if she mattered. "Sir, I should go, she whispered, standing abruptly. But before she could take a step, his hand caught her wrist. She froze. A long silence filled the space between them. The heat of his touch burned through her skin. She didn't dare look at him, but she could feel his gaze locked onto her. Aisha. His voice was quiet, but there was something unyielding in it. This was a line they weren't supposed to cross, and yet neither of them moved. Not yet. Aisha's entire body tensed as Khaled's fingers remained wrapped around her wrist. His touch was firm, yet not forceful. It was a silent demand, a quiet insistence that she stay, an unspoken message she didn't dare to interpret. Her mind screamed at her to pull away, to create distance between them before it was too late. But her body betrayed her. Slowly, she raised her eyes to meet his. And when she did, she saw something she had never seen in a man like him before. Vulnerability. Khaled Al-Fayez, the untouchable, the ruthless, the man who commanded boardrooms without breaking a sweat, was standing in front of her, his gaze filled with something raw and unfamiliar. Her breath hitched, and the moment stretched between them. Then, as if suddenly realizing what he had done, he released her wrist. She took an immediate step back, her heart hammering against her ribs. I should go. He said nothing, but he didn't stop her this time. Aisha turned, practically fleeing from the office, her mind racing. She needed to remind herself who she was. She was a maid, a servant in his world, and he was her boss. Nothing more. But that moment had felt like something more. She barely made it back to the kitchen before her legs felt weak beneath her. She gripped the counter for support, inhaling sharply. She needed to forget about this, but the house staff wouldn't let her. You were in his office for a long time, one of the maids whispered as she passed. Another chuckled. Seems like the boss has taken an interest in someone. Aisha's stomach twisted. If they had noticed, it meant others would too, and that was dangerous. She forced herself to act normal, going about her tasks as if nothing had changed. Because nothing had changed. Khaled was just being kind. That's all it was. At least that's what she tried to tell herself. But the next few days proved otherwise. She started noticing him, everywhere. It was in the way his gaze lingered on her during meals, when he sat at the long dining table while the staff moved around him. It was in the way he passed by the rooms where she worked, his footsteps slow, deliberate, as if he was searching for her. And worst of all, it was in the way he protected her. The other house staff still worked grueling hours, but her schedule had been permanently changed. She no longer had to wake up at 3 in the morning. She no longer collapsed from exhaustion, and they all knew why. She's special to him, someone whispered one afternoon. She's different, another added. Aisha kept her head down, but her hands trembled as she washed the dishes. She wanted to scream at them. She wasn't special. But deep down, a dangerous part of her wondered if maybe, just maybe, she was. And then, the world reminded her exactly where she stood. One evening, after finishing her tasks, she stepped outside into the garden for a moment of fresh air. The mansion was quiet, the sun setting behind the skyline. And that's when she heard it. Voices, low, hushed, coming from around the corner. She hesitated, then took a careful step closer, pressing herself against the wall. I heard Khaled's been paying attention to one of the maids, a man's voice sneered. Aisha's blood ran cold. A second voice chuckled. That's what I've been told too. Some African girl. You think his family will tolerate that? She felt sick. The first man scoffed. His father would rather burn this house to the ground before he lets his son be with someone like her. Aisha's stomach clenched, her fingers curling into fists. She had known. Deep down, she had always known. People like her didn't belong in his world. And yet, why did it hurt so much to hear it? Before she could move, another voice cut through the conversation. "You'd be wise to keep your mouth shut." Aisha's breath caught. Khaled. His voice was sharp, controlled, but laced with warning. The two men immediately stiffened. "Sir, I don't care what you've heard." His tone was ice cold. "If I hear you speaking about my personal affairs again, you won't just lose your jobs, you'll lose everything." Silence. Then, hurried footsteps as the men scattered. Aisha's hands trembled as she pressed herself tighter against the wall, her heart racing. Khaled had defended her, again, but it didn't matter, because the truth had already been spoken, and his family would never accept her. Aisha sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the floor, her hands gripping the fabric of her uniform. She needed to leave. The realization had settled deep in her bones ever since she overheard those men talking in the garden. Khaled's family would never accept her. His world was built on legacy, on power, on names that carried centuries of prestige. She was just a maid, an outsider, someone who had no right to even dream of being anything more than what she was. And yet, he had defended her. The way Khaled had threatened those men, the coldness in his voice, the way he had stood up for her. It made her chest ache. It made her heart beat faster than it should. But this wasn't a fairy tale. She had to protect herself before it was too late. With a deep breath, she stood and reached for her small suitcase, hidden under the bed. She would leave tonight, before things got worse, before he made it impossible to go. But fate had other plans. As she hurried down the hallway, gripping the handle of her bag, she collided with a wall of solid muscle. No, not a wall. Him. Khaled. His strong hands instinctively caught her arms before she could stumble back. His dark eyes flickered down to the suitcase in her grip. His entire body went still. "What are you doing?" His voice was low, dangerously quiet. Aisha's throat dried up. She couldn't lie. He would see right through her. "I'm leaving." The words sounded final, even to her own ears. Khaled's jaw clenched. "No, you're not." She forced herself to take a step back, forcing him to let go. "I can't stay here. I heard what they said." His expression darkened. "Forget them." "I can't." Her voice cracked. "Because they're right." Khaled exhaled sharply, his fingers flexing at his sides as if restraining himself. "Do you think I care about their opinions?" "They're not just anyone, Khaled. It's your family." A muscle ticked in his jaw. He didn't deny it. And that's what hurt the most. Aisha took a shaky breath. "I won't be the reason you fight with them." His eyes flashed. "You think I would let them dictate my life?" "Yes," she whispered, because it was the truth. His family wasn't just wealthy, they were powerful. And powerful people never let emotions dictate their decisions. Khaled had been raised in that world. His duty was to marry a woman of status, to maintain his family's empire, not to fall in love with a maid. His silence was all the confirmation she needed. Aisha gripped the handle of her suitcase tighter and turned away. If he wouldn't let her go, she would force him to. But before she could take a single step, his hand caught her wrist. Just like before. Just like the first time. Only this time his grip wasn't cold or distant. It was desperate. "Aisha." He said her name like a plea, like a man losing control. Tears burned at the back of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Let me go, Khaled." His grip tightened. Then, he did something she never expected. He pulled her against him. A sharp gasp left her lips as she crashed into his chest, his arms wrapping around her as if he was terrified she would disappear. Aisha's hands instinctively pressed against his chest, her pulse hammering beneath her skin. "Khaled." "I don't want you to leave," he murmured, his voice rough, low, filled with something she had never heard from him before. She squeezed her eyes shut. "This isn't right." "I don't care." His words shattered the last bit of restraint inside her. She slowly tilted her head up to look at him. His face was inches from hers, his dark gaze dangerous, conflicted, intense. A war was raging inside him, and she knew, if she let this moment happen, there would be no turning back. Aisha swallowed. "If you do this, if you don't let me go, you'll regret it." Khaled's eyes darkened. "The only thing I'll regret is letting you walk away." Silence. The kind that changes everything. His gaze flickered to her lips, and before either of them could think, he kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't hesitant. It was a declaration. Aisha's breath caught, her fingers curling into his shirt as his lips moved against hers, slow but consuming, as if he was trying to erase all the walls between them. And for a moment, she let him. She let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, love could be enough. But deep down, she knew. The world wouldn't let them have this, and the real war was just beginning. Aisha barely slept that night. Khaled had kissed her, and worse, she had kissed him back. She lay in her small bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over in her head. The warmth of his lips, the way he had held her as if she was something precious, something worth fighting for. But it was a lie, because reality would never allow this. By morning, she had made a decision. She had to pretend it never happened. She dressed carefully, making sure to wear her uniform with precision, her hair neatly tied back. She needed to be invisible again. That was the only way to survive. But when she stepped out of her quarters and entered the mansion, she felt his presence immediately. Khaled stood at the end of the hallway, dressed in his usual suit, but something about him was different today. His posture was tense, his jaw clenched, his eyes searching for her. The moment their gazes met, her heart stuttered. She looked away first. She hurried toward the kitchen, determined to act as if nothing had changed. But before she could even step inside, a voice stopped her. "Aisha!" Her stomach twisted. She turned slowly, finding Khaled standing behind her. She swallowed hard. "Sir." His expression darkened at the formality. "We need to talk." "There's nothing to talk about," she said quickly, her voice even, controlled. "Last night was a mistake." His eyes flashed with something dangerous. "Is that what you really believe?" Aisha lifted her chin, forcing herself to lie. "Yes." Silence. She saw the muscle in his jaw twitch. For the first time, Khaled Al-Fayez looked like a man who had lost control. But before he could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps shattered the tension. And then, everything fell apart. A deep voice cut through the hallway like a blade. "Khaled." Aisha stiffened. She knew that voice. She turned slowly, her blood running cold. Two men stood at the entrance of the mansion. One of them was older, tall, and commanding. His presence alone sent a ripple of fear through the room. His sharp, assessing gaze flicked from Khaled to Aisha before his lips curled in displeasure. Khaled's father. Beside him stood another man, his cousin, Rami, a man known for his cruelty behind closed doors. Aisha's hands trembled. She had been right all along. They weren't supposed to be seen together. And now they had been. Khaled stepped forward, his shoulders squared, his expression carefully blank. Father. His father's gaze didn't leave Aisha. She felt stripped bare, judged, condemned. "What is this?" the older man asked, his voice dripping with quiet fury. "A maid? This is who you disgrace our family name with?" Aisha felt as if the air had been punched out of her lungs. Khaled's body tensed, but he didn't look away. He didn't deny it. His father took a slow, deliberate step forward. "You think you can do as you please? That you can throw away everything for a—" He stopped, his eyes narrowing as if even speaking about her was beneath him. Aisha wanted to disappear, but Khaled's voice cut through the moment. "I won't let you speak about her that way." Dead silence. His father's expression darkened. "You forget your place." "No." Khaled's voice was firm, unshaken. "You forget that my life is mine." Aisha's breath hitched. His father exhaled slowly, as if barely containing his anger. "Enough of this foolishness." Then he turned to her. Her blood turned to ice. "You will leave this house," he said, his voice like steel. "Now." Aisha's knees nearly buckled. She had expected this. She had always known that this was how it would end. But before she could even respond, Khaled stepped in front of her. "No," he said sharply. "She's not going anywhere." His father's lips curled in cold amusement. "Are you really going to fight me over this, Khaled?" "If I have to," Khaled said, his tone a direct challenge. Aisha's breath caught. This wasn't just defiance. This was war. But Khaled's father had come prepared. He nodded to Rami, who smirked before pulling something out of his jacket pocket. A folder. He tossed it onto the nearby table. Khaled's eyes narrowed. "What is this?" His father's voice was deceptively calm. "It's a contract." Aisha's heart stopped. "A marriage contract," his father continued smoothly, "with Nadine al-Zaman." Aisha felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She had heard that name before. Nadine al-Zaman, heir to one of the most powerful business empires in the Middle East. Beautiful, intelligent, perfect. And now she was to be Khaled's wife. Aisha clenched her fists, willing herself not to crumble. Khaled's expression darkened as he picked up the folder, flipping through the pages. His father's voice was filled with cold certainty. "You will marry her, Khaled. It has already been decided." Aisha stared at the ground, her vision blurring. This was it. This was the moment she had feared all along. She was nothing in their world. And now she had lost him before she ever truly had him. Khaled's voice was quiet, dangerous. "You think you can control me?" His father met his gaze without hesitation. "You will sign that contract, or you will lose everything." Aisha's pulse pounded in her ears. She knew what that meant. If Khaled refused, he wouldn't just be cut off, he would be destroyed. His empire, his fortune, his name, everything he had built, gone. The tension in the air was suffocating. Khaled exhaled, his fingers gripping the folder tightly. His jaw was set, his body stiff. Then, without warning, he turned to her. and in his eyes, she saw it. The choice he had to make. Her or his entire world. Aisha swallowed hard. She had to be the one to end this. She had to protect him. She forced herself to lift her chin, her voice steady despite the agony inside her. "Khalid," she whispered, "you should do it." His eyes snapped to hers, shocked. She smiled, though it took everything inside her. Marry her. She saw his heart break in real time. And then, before she could change her mind, before he could fight her on it, she turned and walked away. Straight out of his life. Aisha's footsteps echoed through the grand hall as she walked away, her heart shattering with every step. She didn't look back. She couldn't. If she did, she knew she wouldn't have the strength to leave. And she had to leave. Khalid had a future already carved out for him. A wife, a legacy, a dynasty. She was just a maid, a nobody in his world. His father had made it clear. If Khalid chose her, he would lose everything. And she couldn't let that happen. Her hands trembled as she pushed open the mansion's heavy doors, stepping into the cold night air. She inhaled sharply, trying to hold back the tears. She had done the right thing. But if it was the right thing, why did it hurt so much? Behind her, the mansion erupted into chaos. "Khalid!" his father's voice thundered. "You will not go after her!" Aisha's heart clenched, but she forced herself to keep walking. He wouldn't follow her. He couldn't. But she was wrong. Because just as she reached the gates, she heard his voice. "Aisha!" She froze. Her breath caught. And then, footsteps. Fast, desperate. She turned just as Khalid burst through the front doors, ignoring his father's furious shouts. His suit jacket was unbuttoned, his hair slightly disheveled, his eyes filled with something wild, untamed, something that made her knees weak. "Stop," she whispered. "Go back." But Khalid wasn't listening. He closed the distance between them in seconds, and before she could protest, before she could tell him again that they couldn't do this, he cupped her face and kissed her. The world blurred. It was different from the last time. This kiss wasn't just desperation. It was defiance. It was a declaration to the universe that he wasn't letting her go. Aisha felt her resolve crumbling. She was drowning in him. But then, reality crashed back in. "Khalid!" His father's voice was filled with rage. They broke apart just as guards stormed the courtyard, followed by Rami and Khalid's father. Aisha's entire body went rigid. This was it. "You are making a fool of yourself," his father seethed. "Do you have any idea what you're throwing away?" Khalid didn't even look at him. His eyes were on Aisha, only her. "I don't care about the company," he said, his voice steady. "I don't care about the fortune. I don't care about the marriage contract." His father's expression darkened. "Then what do you care about?" Khalid's grip on Aisha tightened. "Her." Aisha's breath hitched. His father laughed, a bitter, sharp sound. "And what will you give her, Khalid? You think love is enough? Without your name, without your power, who will you be?" A long silence stretched between them. Khalid finally turned to face his father, and he smiled. A small, quiet, knowing smile. "I'll be a man who made his own choices," he said. "That's more than you can say." His father's face darkened with fury. "If you leave with her, Khalid, you are no longer my son." Aisha's heart stopped. This was it. If Khalid chose her, he lost everything. His inheritance, his position, his family. He would be nothing. Aisha stepped back, shaking her head. "No," she whispered. "I can't let you do this." Khaled turned to her, eyes blazing. "You don't get to decide that, Aisha." Tears filled her eyes. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," he interrupted. "For the first time in my life, I understand." His father scoffed. "You'll regret this, Khaled." Khaled didn't even blink. "No," he said quietly. "I won't." And then he took Aisha's hand and led her away, through the gates, past the guards, out of the life he had once known. The night swallowed them whole, and for the first time in years, Khaled al-Fayez was free. Aisha's legs felt weak as they walked through the empty streets. "What are we going to do?" she whispered. Khaled stopped, turning to face her. His hands slid to her waist, his touch grounding her. "We build something new," he said. "Together." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "But you had everything." His lips curved into a soft, knowing smile. "No, Aisha." He brushed a tear from her cheek. "I didn't have you." And for the first time in her life, Aisha let herself believe in a love that was worth fighting for.